The carriage that arrived at Winterbourne House on the morning of the foreclosure carried no crest upon its door, and yet everyone gathered on the frost-hardened lawn understood, with the particular dread of people who have run out of options, that whatever stepped down from it would decide the fate of the family within. Eleanor Winters stood at the top of the stone steps, with her mother's trembling hand gripped in her own, watching Lord Harrow's solicitor cross the gravel with a leather case full of documents that would, within the hour, strip her family of the only home she had ever known. She did not yet know that the answer to her family's ruin was already living among them, disguised in a gardener's coarse coat, kneeling at that very moment among the rosebeds at the edge of the drive, pretending an interest in soil and stem that masked a truth so enormous it would, in time, undo everything the Winters family believed about rank, love, and the quiet, patient courage of a man willing to bury his own name beneath years of borrowed dirt beneath his fingernails. No one on that frozen lawn suspected that the humble man called Thomas, hired 8 months prior to tend Winterbourne's neglected gardens, was in fact Edmund Ashgrove, Duke of Whitmore, one of the wealthiest and most eligible men in the entire kingdom, a man who had walked away from his own estate under an assumed name for reasons he had shared with no one, and who was about to watch the woman he had grown to love stand at the edge of losing everything, powerless to help her, without revealing a secret that would change both their lives forever. Eleanor had been raised to believe that Winterbourne House would always stand, a certainty inherited from a father whose optimism had outpaced his ledgers for the better part of 2 decades. Sir Charles Winters was a kind man, generous to a fault, the sort of landlord who forgave a tenant's late rent without a second thought and lent money to friends who never intended repayment, and it was precisely this generosity, compounded across years of poor harvests and worse investments, that had finally delivered the family into the grasping hands of Lord Harrow, a neighbouring landholder whose fortune had been built not through generosity, but through the patient, merciless collection of other men's debts. Harrow had purchased Sir Charles's outstanding notes from 3 separate creditors over the past year, quietly consolidating enough leverage that he now held the power to seize Winterbourne outright unless the family could produce a sum so large that Eleanor's mother wept openly at the mere mention of the figure. It was into this desperation that Harrow had inserted his true intention weeks earlier, arriving not merely as a creditor demanding payment, but as a suitor proposing a solution, offering to forgive the family's entire debt in exchange for Eleanor's hand in marriage, a proposal delivered with the cold satisfaction of a man who had engineered the family's ruin specifically to force this very outcome. Eleanor had refused him 3 times already, each refusal met with Harrow's patient, unbothered smile, the smile of a man who understood that time and debt were allies far more persuasive than any argument he could make himself. She refused him a 4th time, on the very morning the solicitor arrived with his leather case of documents, standing on the frozen steps of the only home she had ever known, and telling Lord Harrow, in a voice that shook only slightly, that she would rather see Winterbourne sold to strangers than sold into a marriage built on nothing but her family's desperation. Harrow's expression did not change, but something colder moved behind his eyes, a promise that her refusal would cost the family more than she yet understood, and as his carriage rolled back down the frost-hardened drive, Eleanor turned to find the gardener Thomas watching her from the rosebeds with an expression she could not quite name, something between admiration and a grief so old it seemed to belong to a different man entirely. She had noticed him before, of course, in the small, half-conscious way one notices a fixture of daily life that has slowly, without permission, become something more. Thomas had arrived at Winterbourne the previous spring, hired by her father on the recommendation of a travelling agricultural agent, who had vanished from the county before anyone thought to verify his claims. And within weeks, the neglected gardens that had suffered years of insufficient staff and insufficient funds began, under his quiet and careful hands, to bloom again into something resembling their former glory. He spoke little of his past, deflecting questions with a gentle humour that discouraged further inquiry without ever seeming rude, and though the other servants occasionally remarked on his strange manner of speech, a precision too refined for a labourer's education, Eleanor had always assumed it was simply the mark of a man who had once known better circumstances and preferred not to dwell on whatever misfortune had reduced him to tending other men's gardens for his bread. What she had not assumed, what she could not possibly have imagined standing on those frozen steps with Lord Harrow's carriage disappearing down the drive, was that the gentle, watchful gardener, who had spent 8 months quietly restoring her family's grounds, had done so not merely for wages, but as part of a deception so vast it encompassed his entire identity. A deception he had constructed for reasons that had nothing to do with the Winters family at all, at least not at first. Reasons rooted in a wound from his own past that had convinced him he could never again trust that any woman's affection for him was genuine rather than calculated toward his title and fortune. Edmund Ashgrove had once been betrothed, years before he ever set foot on Winterbourne's grounds, to a woman who had professed love for him with every appearance of sincerity, only for Edmund to discover, mere weeks before their wedding, that she had been simultaneously corresponding with his own younger brother, weighing which Ashgrove men offered the more advantageous match should circumstances shift. The betrayal had cut deep enough that Edmund had spent the years since retreating further and further from society's marriage markets, until finally, driven by a restlessness he could not fully explain even to himself, he had assumed the name Thomas and taken employment as a common gardener, determined to discover, once and for all, whether any woman could love the man beneath the title rather than the title itself. He had not expected to find that woman at Winterbourne House. He had certainly not expected to find her burdened by a debt so crushing that a predatory neighbor could hold her family's entire future hostage to his own marital ambitions. And he had most certainly not expected the particular, aching helplessness that settled into his chest as he watched Eleanor Winters stand alone on her family's steps, refusing a marriage that would save her home at the cost of her own happiness, while he himself, a man who could have ended her family's crisis with a single letter bearing his true seal, remained silent behind the disguise of a gardener's coat, unwilling yet to surrender the fragile, precious thing that had grown between them across 8 months of shared mornings among the roses. The tension of that silence, the growing awareness that his continued deception now carried consequences far graver than his own wounded heart, would follow him through the difficult weeks ahead, weeks in which Lord Harrow's patience would finally run out entirely, forcing a confrontation that neither Eleanor nor the man she knew as Thomas could delay much longer. The weeks following Harrow's 4th rejected proposal brought a new and sharper cruelty to his methods, no longer content to wait for desperation alone to deliver Eleanor into his arms. He began calling in every remaining favor his consolidated debts afforded him, pressuring local merchants to refuse the Winters family further credit, quietly discouraging the few remaining tenants from paying their rents on schedule by spreading whispers that Winterbourne's ownership would soon change hands regardless, and worst of all, dispatching his own men to survey the estate's boundaries with an proprietary confidence that made clear he considered the outcome already settled. Eleanor watched her father age visibly under the strain, his once ready optimism curdling into a haunted, sleepless worry that kept him pacing the library floor long past midnight, poring over ledgers that offered no solutions no matter how many times he reorganized their columns. Her mother, gentler by nature and less equipped to hide her fear, began to speak, in careful, hesitant tones, of the possibility that Eleanor might yet reconsider Harrow's offer, not because she wished her daughter into an unhappy marriage, but because the alternative, watching the family's entire history and legacy sold away to strangers, felt to her like a grief too large to survive. It was during this darkest stretch of weeks that Eleanor found herself, more and more often, seeking out the quiet company of the gardens, and by extension, the quiet company of the man who tended them. Thomas never pressed her for details of the family's troubles, never offered false comfort or empty reassurance, but simply worked alongside her when she appeared among the roses, listening when she spoke, and remaining companionably silent when she did not. And in his steady, undemanding presence, Eleanor found something she had not realized she was missing amid the constant pressure of her family's crisis. A space where she was not the desperate daughter whose marriage might save or doom her family, but simply a woman among flowers, momentarily free of the weight pressing in from every other corner of her life. It was in this space, tending a stubborn climbing rose that refused to take to its trellis, no matter how carefully it was guided, that Eleanor finally asked Thomas the question she had been circling for weeks, asking him directly what he thought she should do, whether love was truly worth more than a family's survival, or whether some sacrifices were simply the price a woman of her position was always destined to pay. Thomas set down his shears slowly, and for a long moment he did not answer, his gaze fixed on the half-trained rosevine, as though the question had reached somewhere far deeper than the garden path where they stood. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight and conviction that startled her, a certainty that seemed to come from lived experience rather than mere philosophy, and he told her that he had once believed, in a life he rarely spoke of, that duty and sacrifice were the only currencies that mattered, that a person's own happiness was a luxury to be set aside for the sake of family, name, and obligation, and that this belief had cost him something he still grieved, though he would not say what. He told her that he no longer believed it, that he had come to understand, through painful experience, that a marriage built on desperation, rather than genuine regard, was its own kind of ruin, quieter and slower than losing a house, but no less devastating in the end. Eleanor studied him as he spoke, struck once again by the strange, unaccountable depth of a man who tended roses for wages, and yet spoke with the hard-won wisdom of someone who had lost far more than a garden could ever hold, and though she did not yet understand the full shape of the secret standing between them, she felt, with a certainty that frightened her, that whatever answer she gave to Harrow's next proposal, she wanted this man, this quiet gardener with sorrow behind his eyes, to be part of deciding what came after. The confrontation Eleanor had been dreading arrived sooner than expected, forced by circumstances far more dire than even Lord Harrow's mounting pressure had suggested. A letter arrived at Winterbourne on a grey, wind-battered afternoon, delivered not by the usual post, but by a messenger in Harrow's own livery, informing Sir Charles that the full sum of the family's consolidated debt would be called due within a fortnight, with immediate seizure of the estate to follow, should payment not be received in full. The timeline was cruel by design, too short for any legitimate avenue of relief, and everyone in the household understood, without needing it spoken aloud, that the letter's true purpose was not to collect a debt, but to force Eleanor's hand entirely, leaving marriage to Harrow as the only remaining path to save her family from utter ruin. Sir Charles, broken by months of sleepless worry, finally suggested to his daughter, with tears he could not fully hide, that perhaps the time had come to accept what fate seemed determined to demand of her, and Eleanor, watching her father's proud spirit crumble beneath a burden he had never intended to leave her, felt the walls of her own resistance beginning, for the first time, to genuinely waver. It was that same evening, wandering the gardens in the fading light with her thoughts in turmoil, that Eleanor finally confronted Thomas with the full truth of the fortnight's deadline, no longer able to carry the weight of the decision in silence. She told him of the letter, of her father's despair, of the marriage she now believed she had no choice but to accept, and as she spoke, watching his face in the dimming light, she saw something shift behind his careful composure, a flicker of anguish, so raw it startled her into silence mid-sentence. He asked her, his voice tight with an emotion she could not fully place, whether she truly believed marriage to a man like Harrow was the only solution remaining, and when she answered, with the flat, exhausted honesty of a woman who had exhausted every other option, that she saw no other path forward, Thomas turned away from her, toward the darkening tree line, his shoulders set with the particular tension of a man wrestling against a decision he had avoided for far too long. When he turned back to her, something in his bearing had changed entirely. The careful, humble posture of 8 months as a gardener falling away to reveal a stillness and gravity that Eleanor had glimpsed only in fragments before, in moments of unguarded honesty among the roses. He told her, in a voice that no longer belonged to the man she had known as Thomas, that there was another path, one he had been unwilling to offer, because it would require a confession he had dreaded making since the very night he first arrived at her family's gates. and before Eleanor could ask what he meant, he told her his true name, watching her face carefully as the words landed, watching 8 months of assumptions and quiet affection collide. In the space of a single sentence, with a truth so enormous, it seemed to rearrange the very air between them. He was not a Garderner fallen on hard circumstances. He was Edmund Ashgrove, Duke of Whitmore, a man whose fortune could erase Lord Harrow's leverage as easily as brushing dust from a windowsill, and he had spent 8 months disguised beneath a false name, not to deceive her family out of cruelty, but because he had needed, more desperately than she could yet understand, to discover whether he could ever again be loved for himself alone, rather than for the title now standing revealed between them. Eleanor's first reaction was not gratitude, nor relief at the sudden, impossible solution now offered to her family's crisis, but a sharp, wounded anger that surprised even her, a feeling of having been deceived across 8 months of what she had believed, however cautiously, was an honest friendship built on equal footing. She stepped back from him among the darkening roses, demanding to know how much of what had passed between them had been genuine, and how much had been merely another chapter in whatever test he had constructed to satisfy his own wounded suspicions about the honesty of women's hearts. And Edmund, watching the hurt behind her fury, understood with a sinking clarity that his confession, however necessary, had opened a wound he had not fully anticipated, one that would require far more than a title and a fortune to heal, and that the fortnight, now bearing down upon her family's fate, might prove to be the smaller of the 2 crises now facing them both. Edmund did not retreat from her anger, though every instinct honed by his own past betrayal urged him toward the safety of silence and distance he had relied upon for years. Instead, he stood his ground among the darkening rosebeds and told her the fuller truth he had withheld even from himself for much of the past 8 months, that he had arrived at Winterbourne intending only a brief experiment, a season at most, before returning to his true life, having satisfied his curiosity about whether ordinary labor and anonymity might reveal something honest about the people around him. He told her that the season had stretched far longer than he intended, because he had found himself, week after week, inventing reasons to remain, first telling himself it was the satisfaction of restoring neglected gardens, then admitting privately that it was the particular quality of her company he could not bring himself to abandon, her willingness to speak to him as an equal, her curiosity about matters far beyond a gardener's expected concerns, the quiet dignity she carried even as her family's fortunes crumbled around her. He told her that he had watched Lord Harrow's cruelty unfold across the recent weeks with a fury he had been forced to swallow again and again, a fury made worse by the knowledge that revealing himself sooner might have spared her family weeks of needless suffering, and that his silence, though born of old wounds rather than any wish to cause her pain, was nonetheless a failure he intended to spend considerable effort making right. Eleanor listened to this confession with her arms crossed against the evening chill, and her heart caught in a painful tangle of relief, anger, and a reluctant, disorienting tenderness she could not fully suppress, even amid her hurt. She asked him, her voice steadier now, though still edged with the residue of her earlier fury, why he had not simply told her the truth the moment Harrow's threats began, why he had allowed her to stand alone against a predatory neighbor's schemes for weeks, when a single revealed name might have ended the entire crisis in an afternoon. Edmund's answer, when it came, carried none of the practiced ease she suspected a true duke might have deployed in defense of his own choices, but instead, the halting honesty of a man forced to examine a decision he was no longer certain he could justify even to himself. He admitted that fear, plain and unheroic fear, had held him silent longer than any noble reasoning could excuse. Fear that revealing his title would transform, in an instant, every genuine moment they had shared into something calculated and suspect in her eyes. Fear that she would look at him afterward the way his former betrothed's family had once looked at his fortune, with the particular hungry calculation he had spent years learning to dread rather than welcome. He told her he understood now, watching the hurt still evident in her expression, that his silence had cost her more than his own comfort was worth, and that whatever trust remained to rebuild between them, He intended to earn it honestly, beginning that very night. Regardless of whether she ultimately chose to accept the solution his true identity now made possible. The solution itself, once the initial shock of revelation had settled into something Eleanor could examine with clearer eyes, proved simpler in practice than the tangled emotions surrounding it. Edmund's fortune, secured through generations of careful stewardship rather than Harrow's predatory consolidation of other men's misfortune, could clear the Winters family's entire debt without noticeable strain, and his standing as Duke of Whitmore carried sufficient weight within the county's legal and social circles to ensure that Lord Harrow's aggressive maneuvering, much of which skirted the boundaries of legitimate practice, would face far greater scrutiny than Harrow had ever anticipated when he began his campaign against a struggling baronet's family. But Eleanor, even as the practical crisis dissolved with startling speed once Edmund's true identity entered the equation, found herself facing a far more complicated question underneath the relief. The question of whether she could accept a rescue that arrived wrapped so completely in deception, whether a marriage built now on gratitude and reprieve from ruin might carry the same essential wound as the marriage to Harrow she had spent months refusing, a bargain rather than a genuine union of hearts freely given. She told Edmund as much on the following morning, meeting him not among the roses this time, but in the more formal setting of Winterbourne's small drawing room, where she informed him, with a composure that cost her considerable effort, that she would accept his offer to clear her family's debt, but that she would not accept any proposal of marriage born merely from circumstance and gratitude, that if he wished to court her honestly, he would need to do so as himself, Edmund Ashgrove, Duke of Whitmore, without the shield of a gardener's disguise or the leverage of a rescued fortune standing between them, and that she reserved the right to refuse him entirely should she come to believe their bond had been built on foundations too compromised to bear the weight of a lifetime together. Edmund received this condition not with the wounded pride she half expected from a man of his rank, but with something closer to relief, a recognition that her demand for honest courtship, freely chosen rather than obligated by circumstance, was precisely the proof he had spent 8 months secretly hoping to find, evidence that Eleanor's regard for him had never been calculated toward his fortune, since she was, in this very moment, deliberately setting that fortune's leverage aside in favor of something harder won and infinitely more valuable. The weeks that followed unfolded with a strange, careful formality neither of them had quite anticipated. Edmund, arriving at Winterbourne now in his true name and station, welcomed through the front doors rather than slipping in through the garden gate, courting Eleanor with the deliberate patience of a man determined to prove that the connection between them could survive the full weight of his title now standing openly between them. He brought no lavish gifts calculated to dazzle, understanding instinctively that such gestures would only deepen Eleanor's fear that gratitude and obligation, rather than genuine affection, drove whatever answer she might eventually give him. Instead, he continued, whenever circumstances allowed, to seek her out in the gardens that had first brought them together, working alongside her, among the very roses he had once tended in disguise, proving through consistency, rather than grand declaration, that the man she had come to trust, across 8 anonymous months, remained, in every essential way, the same man now standing before her, under his true name. Lord Harrow did not accept his sudden reversal of fortune gracefully. Word of Edmund's true identity spread through the county with predictable speed once the debt was formally cleared, and the legal challenges to Harrow's aggressive collection practices began. And Harrow, humiliated before neighbors who had once feared his growing influence, retreated into a bitterness that curdled quickly into a final, desperate scheme to salvage something from the ruin of his ambitions. He began, in the weeks following his exposure, quietly spreading rumors through the county's social circles, suggesting that the Duke of Whitmore's elaborate deception had been motivated not by any genuine search for honest affection, but by darker purposes entirely, hinting without quite stating outright that Edmund's months disguised as a common laborer within a respectable household suggested instability, or worse, some scandal from his past that respectable society had not yet uncovered. A whisper campaign calculated to poison Eleanor's reputation alongside Edmund's own, ensuring that even if their courtship survived Harrow's financial schemes, it might yet collapse beneath the weight of society's judgment. The rumors reached Eleanor first through her mother, who returned from a visit to a neighboring estate, with her composure visibly shaken, reporting whispered conversations that had fallen silent the moment she entered a room, glances exchanged among women she had known for years that now carried a wary, calculating quality she had never encountered from them before. Eleanor understood immediately the source of this sudden chill, and though she recognized Harrow's petty cruelty for exactly what it was, a final, desperate attempt to punish her family for escaping his grasp, she found herself unexpectedly shaken by how quickly the county's opinion could shift, how thin the foundation of social acceptance had always been beneath her family's recent troubles. She raised the matter with Edmund during one of their garden walks, watching his expression carefully as she described the whispers now circulating, testing, she admitted to herself, whether his answer would reveal a man genuinely unbothered by scandal or merely one skilled at concealing his own alarm. Edmund's response surprised her with its directness. He told her that he had anticipated some version of this reaction the moment he decided to reveal himself, that any man of significant title who spent months living in disguise among the households he might have simply visited openly invited exactly this kind of suspicious speculation, and that he had weighed this risk carefully before ever confessing the truth to her, concluding that whatever damage such rumors might do to his own reputation was a price he was entirely willing to pay for the chance to court her honestly. But he acknowledged, with a seriousness that steadied rather than alarmed her, that the cost to her own reputation was a different matter entirely, one he had not fully considered until her mother's report made the danger concrete, and he told her, with a resolve that left no room for doubt, that he intended to address Harrow's whisper campaign directly and publicly, rather than allow it to fester unanswered, a decision that would require confronting Harrow before witnesses whose opinions carried genuine weight within the county's social order, a confrontation neither of them could yet predict the full consequences of, but one that Edmund insisted must happen before their courtship could proceed on the honest footing Eleanor had rightfully demanded. The confrontation Edmund had promised took shape at a gathering hosted by the county's most prominent family, an assembly that Harrow, still clinging to whatever social standing his consolidated wealth had once purchased him, could not politely avoid attending without appearing to concede defeat entirely. Edmund arrived with Eleanor at his side, a deliberate statement in itself, and the assembled guests, many of whom had spent recent weeks trading Harrow's careful whispers over tea and correspondence, watched with barely concealed fascination as the Duke of Whitmore crossed the crowded room directly toward the very man who had spent weeks attempting to destroy his reputation and Eleanor's alongside it. What followed was not the shouting confrontation the gathered guests might have anticipated from lesser men, but something colder and, in its way, far more devastating to Harrow's remaining pride. Edmund addressed him with icy, unhurried courtesy, inquiring aloud, in a voice pitched to carry across the room's sudden hush, whether Lord Harrow cared to repeat, now that its true target stood before him, the various speculations he had been circulating regarding the Duke's character and motives. Harrow, cornered by an audience whose good opinion he still desperately needed, attempted first bluster and then a stammering retreat into vague denials, but Edmund pressed with the calm, methodical precision of a man who had spent his adult life navigating far more treacherous political waters than a jealous neighbor's petty gossip, laying out, point by point, the documented predatory practices Harrow had employed against the Winters family, the consolidated debts purchased specifically to manufacture leverage toward an unwanted marriage, the timeline of threats and pressure that painted a picture far darker than any rumor Harrow had attempted to spread in return. By the time Edmund finished speaking, the room's collective sympathy had shifted entirely, and Harrow, his schemes laid bare before the very society whose approval he had spent years cultivating, found himself facing a humiliation far more complete and permanent than the simple loss of a marriage prospect, a social ruin of his own making that would follow him through every gathering and correspondence for years to come, while Eleanor, watching from Edmund's side, as the truth finally overtook every careful lie Harrow had constructed, felt something settle in her chest that she recognized, with quiet astonishment, as the first true certainty she had felt since the entire ordeal began. Harrow's public unraveling did not end with mere embarrassment, for in his increasingly desperate attempts to salvage some remnant of credibility before the assembled county, he made the fatal error of overreaching, producing before the gathered witnesses a letter he claimed proved some impropriety in Edmund's months of disguised residence at Winterbourne, waving the document with the triumphant confidence of a man certain he held one final devastating card. But the letter, when Edmund calmly requested to examine it himself, proved upon closer inspection to be so clumsily altered, dates inconsistent with easily verifiable facts, handwriting inconsistent with any sample of Edmund's known correspondence, that its production served only to confirm, before witnesses who mattered most, that Harrow had descended from petty gossip into outright forgery in his desperation to reclaim what his own greed had cost him. The county's magistrate, present among the gathered guests, requested the letter be surrendered for formal examination, and within days, Harrow's fabrication would unravel entirely, revealing a pattern of similar forged documents used against other struggling families across the county, evidence that would see his remaining influence stripped away through legal proceedings far more thorough and damaging than any single evening's social humiliation could achieve alone. It was a fall as complete as it was deserved, and though Eleanor took no pleasure in another person's ruin, she could not deny the profound relief of watching the man who had engineered her family's crisis face, at last, consequences proportional to the suffering he had so casually inflicted upon them. In the months that followed Harrow's public downfall, Winterbourne House began, slowly and carefully, to heal from the long strain of debt and fear that had nearly claimed it. Sir Charles, freed from the crushing weight of obligations he had spent years failing to manage, found in Edmund not merely a son-in-law's prospective connection, but a genuine ally in restoring the estate's finances to sustainable footing, the two men spending long evenings in the library reviewing ledgers with a collaborative spirit entirely absent from the desperate, solitary calculations Sir Charles had endured alone through the darkest weeks of the crisis. Eleanor's mother, watching her daughter's courtship with Edmund unfold, with a patience and honesty that stood in stark contrast to the desperate arrangement Harrow had once demanded, found herself gradually releasing the fear that had gripped her since the foreclosure notice first arrived, replaced by a cautious, growing hope that her family's fortunes had turned not merely toward survival, but toward genuine happiness. Eleanor herself spent those months testing, in her own careful way, whether the trust she had extended to Edmund could truly bear the weight he was asking her to place upon it. She watched him not merely in moments of grand gesture, of which there were few by his own deliberate choice, but in the smaller, quieter tests of character that mattered far more to a woman who had already been deceived once by a man's careful disguise. She watched how he spoke to the estate's remaining servants, whether the respect and easy familiarity he had shown them as Thomas the Gardener persisted now that he wore his true title openly, and found, with quiet relief, that it did, that Edmund greeted the household staff by name and inquired after their families with the same genuine warmth he had shown them across 8 anonymous months. She watched how he handled the inevitable curiosity and occasional coldness of neighbors still processing the scandal of his disguise, and found that he bore both with a steady equanimity that never once tempted him to blame her or her family for the awkwardness his own choices had created. And slowly, through the accumulated weight of these small, unglamorous proofs, Eleanor found the wound left by his initial deception healing into something she could finally trust, not blind faith restored overnight, but a hard-won confidence built the same patient way the gardens themselves had been restored, one careful season at a time. It was in the garden itself, inevitably, that Edmund finally asked her the question both of them had known was coming since the night of his confession, kneeling not among the formal rose beds this time, but beside the small, stubborn climbing vine that had once refused its trellis under Eleanor's uncertain guidance, and now, months later, had finally taken root and begun its slow climb toward the morning light. He told her that he had spent years believing that his title made honest love impossible to find, that every woman who had ever looked upon him with warmth was surely calculating the value of his fortune rather than the substance of his character, and that she had taught him, through 8 months of unknowing honesty, followed by months more of hard-won, deliberate trust, that this belief had been not wisdom but wound, a fear masquerading as certainty. He asked her, with a vulnerability that belonged entirely to the man rather than the Duke, whether she would consent to build a life alongside him now, with every disguise finally set aside, with nothing left standing between them but the plain truth of who they both actually were. Eleanor's answer came not with hesitation, but with the same quiet, considered certainty that had carried her through every difficult decision since the frost-hardened morning Lord Harrow's carriage first arrived at Winterbourne's gates, and as she spoke it, kneeling beside him among the roses that had witnessed the slow, careful growth of their entire strange and improbable courtship, the county that had once whispered scandal about a duke disguised as a gardener began instead to speak of something else entirely, a story that would be told for years afterward, at gatherings and firesides throughout the region, of a woman who had refused to sell her heart even to save her family's home, and a man who had learned, through months of borrowed dirt beneath his fingernails, that the truest measure of love was not the fortune a suitor could offer, but the honesty he was willing to risk, though even as the story settled into local legend, the oldest residents of the county would sometimes add, in lowered voices over evening tea, that Lord Harrow's forged letters had hinted at other documents never fully recovered, other schemes against other families that the magistrate's investigation had only begun to uncover before the trail went curiously, deliberately cold, a loose thread that would wait, patient as any untended garden, for someone determined enough to finally pull it free.